Hello, listeners. My name is Lowell, and welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. We're at 202, so we're just a little bit past our 200th episode, so we are on to our next century. I don't know. But today I'm joined by my co-host, Sherry.
Hello.
And we have with us Matthew Arcilia.
Yes.
Matthew is a video game reviewer and RPG player who has been with us on the Gauntlet for some time. We're really excited to have him on here to talk about the games because actually Matthew's in an odd time zone and he gets in a lot of interesting games. I see him in a lot of the Eurotime games and other things. So really glad to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, Lowell.
So listeners, in our first segment, each of us is going to go over the RPGs we played, in this case in June and May. And then we're going to talk about, in depth, one of the games that we played on the Gauntlet calendar. So, Sherry, let's start with you. Talk about May and June for us.
So, it's been a little light for me, heavy project time, so I'm being careful with my time so I don't end up grumpy and dragged out during a game. So it's down to just 6. 13th Age and Hearts of Wulin home games face-to-face. It's good to be face-to-face again. I also am playing a playtest of a Forge in the Dark game that Jamie is currently playtesting. It is awesome. You'll hear more about it hopefully soon. On Gauntlet, though, I've been playing iHunt and the Vale Inheritance, but also Hearts of Wulin with a Brindlewood Bay mystery hack in the middle of it. And that's actually the game that I want to talk about today. The game is Hearts of Wulin. It's classic. I love it. It was, it was made for me, I'm pretty sure. Not that Paul would ever say that, and not that it really was. It's just that it is a game that feels natural and has always been my favorite to play because it just does all the things that I want a PBTA game to do. And those things are, it lets you choose your stat, the one that makes the most sense for how your character is, so that every time you make a move, you're describing how your character does it. And you choose it, like if they're clever, then they're using those stats. If they're passionate, it's those things. It just reinforces that role play and that description of your character. And I love that so much. I love the subject matter. So Lowell put together a hack of it and decided that we'd try some mystery elements to it because we've been watching Ancient Detective. It's a series that you can catch on YouTube. It's wonderful. If you can deal with subtitles, definitely go and see it. If you know the language, definitely go and watch it and endure it because it's so fun. It's a great series. And because of that, started this game and it has been a blast. He brought in the Brindlewood Bay mystery mechanics. And if you're unfamiliar with those, I want to stop and describe them. Essentially, it is a system that goes, the GM sets up clues, but doesn't have a particular solution in mind. Instead, there are thematic clues, and there are ways for the players to discover those clues. They have to make a specific move to do that. Those moves are thematic as well, but they're like study moves, and you can also make study moves to see what's going on around you. So you've got both hard fact and this sort of thing of finding a significant thematic clue. And bringing those things together gives you the elements that you as mystery solvers, detectives in this case, have to use to solve that mystery. The other tool that you have is you have a sort of deep intuition that you can call upon. In the original game, it's called putting on the different crowns, essentially, that go along with the authors that the mystery mavens follow. We call them shadows in this game, and they're essentially flashbacks, but thematic flashbacks of a certain kind. Betrayal that you went through, a trauma, something you lost, those sorts of things. You call back to those, and that gives you another chance to succeed when you go to do a particular move, when you go find this key move or whatever. So, very valuable. You need those things. You need those clues. You need to also have a sense of the lay of the land, which is why you're going to make standard study moves. particular mystery will have a complexity. So maybe 10 or 11. You want to get like that many, or maybe 6 for the number of clues that you absolutely have to have before you can move to solving. And the solve action is essentially, think of it like when you've been watching a murder mystery and then it cuts to commercial and you and the other people in the room with you try to figure out who it was that did it. This is essentially what you are doing. You are making up that story. You are figuring it out. You're going, oh, this happened. I think it was this person. They did this. Well, then what about this? Someone else brings up. And so it's the players actually work through what they think is going on. And then you kind of come back to it. As players, as role players, we make a dice roll. And then essentially you're either right, and that turns out good. You're actually able to keep more murders from happening. It's all good. You look glorious and smart and clever. If you fail, usually something bad happens. Your standing goes down as well. But usually it's something bad happens. If you fail really badly, there's usually like a terrible tragedy. So that is pretty much how it works. And the complexities of it when you're in a game can be, essentially, it comes down to how much does the GM trust his players to do these things? How much time and room do you have to work through those? And how do you as players work with each other when you're having these kinds of discussions? Some people are better at those things than others, but for the most part, you've probably done these things naturally all your life. It's just that when you are presented them in a game, it can be kind of intimidating for a lot of people who go, wait, you mean there isn't actually a one solution? There isn't a right answer? What am I supposed to do without a right answer? And it's like, no, you figure out what the right answer was probably going to be, or would be the most interesting, or the one that you want to see, and you roll for it, and then it falls out from there. It's just like any other choice that you make in a game. But you as the players have that chance to talk it through, to come up with the best story, the story that uses the most of those thematic clues, that kind of leans in and does something clever and reveals something about that world. And that's the idea behind it. But it is a different gameplay flow than a lot of gameplay. The GM isn't telling you what to do. They're probably giving you a little bit of like chat back and forth if you ask questions and stuff. But for the most part, it's the players negotiating what the truth is. And it's a really fun change of pace. And it's something that's awesome if you have a group that enjoys that kind of thing and is ready for it. It is got a few pitfalls that it can have. One of them is if you're rushed, it's not going to be as fun as it would be. You're going to come up with something and it'll feel a little slapdash, or something doesn't go together and people are like, well, it could have been, oh, all right, and that can feel a little thing. So you want to be sure that there's time to breathe on it, but not too much time. You don't want it to drag on. And you definitely need to be open to other people's bringing ideas in. Because if someone comes in really strong, that actually takes a lot of the wind out of the sails for other people. And also it cuts down on the potential clever opportunities that you might have if you're pushing too hard. It's great for everyone to be rooting for it to be a particular character as the murderer. It's that. You can have that negotiation, but everyone should come in kind of open to start, going, this clue kind of reminds me of these things and these things. And people putting in what their impressions of these things are, and then building the solution from that. Players should be primed for negotiation and discussion. And the other thing is that you have to have a sense of if a player is saying, I don't get this, I'm having trouble following what's going on, that's okay. They can step back a little bit. You shouldn't try to rush to explain it to them or force it on them. A lot of times when a person has done that is them going, okay, there's been more discussion than I can keep track of. This isn't the way that I work through a thing. And say, well, if you have an idea about any of these things, just throw it in there and we'll work with that. It's just a sort of group dynamic that you kind of need to build when you're doing. But if you do it, it's awesome fun because it gives a chance for the players to build into the world the kind of trouble that they want in the world, the kind of desperation and what makes people murder and those sorts of things. And it is pretty cool. And I guess that if I have any uncertainties about it is that I can see it hitting the table with players who haven't seen it before, or with a GM who isn't comfortable with it, and essentially everyone coming away a little confused about what's gone on and why it was supposed to work. Essentially, it's just a particular kind of collaboration. It's something you do on the couch all the time. If you watch mystery shows, you turn to the other person and go, I think it was this person and this is why. Well, this is the same thing. You're doing that, but you're doing it for maybe 4 or 5 reasons, So it's a little bit more complicated, but it's still super fun. Yeah, I do think it is a thing of the table has to trust each other and the GM has to trust the players. And if you could manage that, you're going to have a good time with this game. And if you can't, it might be a little bit tough until you see it work and you learn to trust that maybe it could. So that's kind of my take on that. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit.
We talk a lot about how GMs in story games and indie games have moved to do a lot more collaboration and sharing of authority and sharing of power, people setting the scene, playing off of what the players come up with. But this is another step further. And I think that's really, for me, the way that I look at it is what you're asking the players to do is very much what the GM does. The GM looks back on the last 3 or 4 sessions and goes, okay, I've seen these things happen. I've seen these things, these details have popped up because of these things. Okay, what's the story that falls out from that?
Yeah.
That's what the players are doing. They're doing exactly the same thing the GM would be doing, of going back and reading the past and saying, this is what the cool thing is that falls out from this.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of ways for players to orient themselves, like when that mystery is ongoing, making those study moves, which are just like kind of factual checks to go, well, was he here at this time? Or those things, which you can bring into the solution. You want to have those to give you some definitional pieces that you can kind of think around. You still need walls. So study moves are that chance for the players to build the walls that they want. The things that they think might be significant, those clues, and then to use those to kind of prop up the thematics of whatever their collaboration is.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool when you can pull it off.
Yeah, and I think it also creates a sense of satisfaction that wouldn't exist in other ways of executing those mysteries. Lowell, you mentioned something about looking back at the past sessions, that a GM would look at the past sessions and sort of try to resolve them. They'll be like, okay, when I started this campaign, I'm thinking from a more trad perspective, for example, traditional perspective. They'll go like, well, I had decided that this person was the big bad and this is what they were doing and this is why. And then they saw the players, a very receptive GM will look at what the players are doing, who they don't like, and how they're reacting to the story, and adjust accordingly, right? And for all you know, that's going to end badly because the players were like, no, yeah, we hated that guy, but we thought it made more sense in your original story or whatever. But instead, the satisfaction comes from the players being able to say, no, I think this is what's going to be cooler, and this is what's going to be cooler. And trying to negotiate a mystery space in that so that it doesn't become the GM's job to mind read what is ultimately satisfying.
Certainly in the mysteries that I had, there were a couple of people that, as I presented the characters, I was like, okay, these people are obvious villains. But of course, the players fell in love with them. The characters literally fell in love with them. So there was a lot of back and forth on that, which is what I adore about a romance thing and about giving it lots of room to breathe.
Great fun.
Let's move on. Matthew, why don't you tell us about your May, June, and what you want to talk about in depth?
Oh my. My May and June was jam-packed. Not only did I play Mothlight, Brindlewood Baywatch, I've been playing Golden Age, The Yellow King, Lost Carcosa. I'm also in a game of Uncharted Worlds. What else is there? I was playing Apocalypse Keys. That's just the stuff I can remember in my hallowed brain. It's a lot. I think the one I really, really want to talk about is Aegon. So, one of our Gauntleteers, is that the right word? Gauntleteers?
Yeah.
Dan Brown set up this thing he called 2 Months of Paragon, in which he takes the Aegon system, as published by Evil Hat, written, I believe, by Sean Nittner and John Harper. I don't know whose name is actually first billed, but, What Dan did was he set up a series where every other session we would just change settings and change characters too. So it was sort of like a tasting menu. Is that the right comparison? Like a tasting menu. Yeah, rotating through different settings. So I believe there were plans to play more settings, but due to schedule shuffling and maybe changing interests of the group, that wasn't the case. But we still went through Surge Protectors, the sort of like Transformers alike by Sean Nittner. We went through The Chamber, which is sort of like a setting that's very inspired by the video games Alan Wake and Control, as well as like the lore of the SCP Foundation on the internet. That was by John Harper. And we also played Rising Tide, a sort of Eco Warriors flavoring of the game by Dan. That's in playtest. Yeah. The way Aegon works is that it kind of lets you tell all these great adventure stories in a very broad and epic sweep. Now, obviously, when we go back to like traditional RPGs, they're so obsessed with like the minutiae of actions. Like, well, let's say, I don't want to use D&D for comparison all the time. So let's say we're talking about like, let's say Shadowrun.
Mm-hmm.
It's always about like the simulationist angles. How much are you going to pay the rent? And then when you start everything, it's like you pick a lock doing this action, and then you trick the guy with this action. Like the whole heist goes from a moment to moment. Every single task is being resolved, and when one thing goes badly, the whole thing goes pear-shaped, which is exciting. But rather than spend 2 to 4 hours like just trying to get through a single scene or two, what Aegon does is it treats every task resolution as an entire scene. So let's say in Surge Protectors, you might be tasked with rescuing civilians in a fire, and you'll just say, well, this is what I do. And it's like, I drive there and I transform and I do the thing. And another player provides a similar description, and you all just roll to see who's coolest. That's all you do. And by and large, whoever rolls the highest just gets the lead in the situation. Everybody else gets to be placed differently through collaborative description. And those who fall underneath the target number will still get to do what they do, but there's going to be a cost. Classic RPG stuff. But that's what I like about it, is that it is actually feasible to tell, let's say, a 20-minute to 40-minute episode of a story within like a 2-hour time frame, which is how much time we blocked off for that game. Just 2 hours, not even 3 or 4, just 2. And it's fun. Now, I think maybe I'll cop to it. Maybe being able to experience so many different settings might have colored my bias towards the system. But it's a system that really excites me for how hackable it possibly is. What worked for me also is the fun pool building. So the way you resolve those scenes is by building pools. And each playbook or each character that you build will have, let's say, again, I haven't read the base Aegon, so you'll have like a name die, a roll die, you'll have a bunch of like basic skills, usually 4 of them, and you'll have a bunch of values. And you just say, using the eco-terrorists, for example, in Rising Tide, I will use my role as an investigator with my background in engineering. I'm doing this for the sake of justice, and I'm putting that together, and you add up all the dice. And you might even say, and I call upon my bond with my fellow player to add another dice. So if you like building dice pools, like with Cortex or other games, then this could be a game for you. And the sort of friendly competitive angle makes it fun too. The thing I'm not so hot on, or at least a little unsure of, is really just mostly nitpicks. In terms of task resolution, I think there's a very tight cap on the dice pool, meaning you can only stack them so high. I'm not saying that going to the world of Vampire the Masquerade or whatever old system of trying to grab like 20 D10s or playing Aberrant and like having, yes, I'll use my molecular powers and have 25 D6s and roll all of those for an extended test is the way to go. But that tightness means that it comes up against another issue I have with the system, which is that difficulties are rolled. So the GM will take 3d6s, roll difficulties, and in the law of averages and statistics, this is going to be fine. But when you're having a bad day, or rather when the GM is having a good day, it gets kind of wild. In one session of Rising Tide, Dan rolled 12, 16, and 18 numbers that were nigh impossible to crack. And that's not the only issue but the fact that some of these dice are expendable. So if you use them, you lose them. If you use, for example, one of your bonds, you don't get to use them again. And there's a choose it or lose it kind of thing, wherein if you, let's say, use 2 dice, one of them will be picked over the other, and it's lost for the session. And what happens is that you could fall into a downward spiral across the session, wherein, I tried to beat this very impressive number because I thought it was really important, and then another high number comes up, I'm like, well, fat chance of meeting that one, and then so on and so forth. I didn't realize my segment would be so mechanically and mathematically focused, but this is where we are. But I gotta emphasize that Aegon's core concept is super fun, like Brindlewood Bay and like PBTA. I think it's immensely adaptable, and I hope more people pick on it. Right now, I got my chin stroking, thinking about what if I do a 24 hack of this one.
Go.
Yeah, I ran a good chunk of Aegon with the base thing, and there's definitely some of what you say of like hitting those numbers and being, the GM's rolled this much. But Aegon, the base one, definitely has a sense of, because there's that track to get pathos, where you you spend stuff and you take hits to get to match thing, where there's actually some like legendary payback that you get for falling down that spiral, and that's kind of built into that sort of Greek tragedy, I guess, that I think may pay off more in the base game.
I see.
I'm sorry, but all of my games are Greek tragedies when I have dice, so
yes.
You should put that in more games for sure.
Yeah, just mechanically ensure it.
Yes, pathos for sure.
Yeah. I also want to say that the other thing that gives me a little bit pause is the experience of playing Aegon-type games will depend more on the players to create moments of roleplay, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
I don't recall an instance where, when we describe our bonds to each other, that it was actually meaningful within the story, except when yanked on explicitly because I want an extra D4.
Yeah.
There could be more mechanics to facilitate that roleplay than just bonds.
I think you're absolutely right on that, especially because you're doing a story each session. And so there's a real pressure to solve the story. And so you don't have as much space in the narrative for players to push those moments. And if the game isn't doing it itself as mechanically, you're not getting to those things.
Yeah, and that's a danger that Forge in the Dark has, too. I mean, if you don't stop and breathe and let the characters interact with each other, that is definitely, you get a real mechanical feel to that. Mind you, it's a smooth machine. It's just that it becomes very, very mechanical feel.
100%. I think, speaking as a video game critic, I want to say that I think it's comparable to a really finely designed shooter, wherein you can keep going into the loop cycle of jumping in, firing away, getting loot, going back, cashing out, going back, and the character interactions just evaporate.
Mm-hmm. So let me talk about my May-June. Off Gauntlet, we did 13th Age and our Supernatural Hearts of Wulin game. On Gauntlet, for our GCOG, our Gauntlet Community Open Gaming, I did 2 one-shots of Hearts of Wulin with a marriage ceremony as the central thing, and it was great because each one ended up very differently, even though we had the same NPCs. That was super fun. I played with Alan with his Against the Dark Conspiracy, which he did as a continuation of the 19-session Night's Black Agents things that I had previously run. He took that and built off of that, so that was really fun. Of course, we did the Hearts of Wulin, Brindlewood Bay, and we did I Hunt, which both of you were in, and the Vale Inheritance. We had illness that cut out the final session of that, so those characters are still hanging in limbo somewhere before the finale, which is always weird. But then the other thing that I've done a 2-month spread of is this new Dune Adventures in the Imperium RPG. And this is the latest 2D20 system from Modiphius, licensed to handle the broad and expansive Dune universe. Now, it coincides with the forthcoming movie. We've seen a couple of new board games come out as well based on Dune, but this doesn't reference or directly borrow visuals from that. This game covers the whole Dune universe, but really up to the first trilogy. It doesn't address the very deeply different future that happens after God, Emperor of Dune. And in fact, I went back to reread the trilogy and I hit God, Emperor of Dune. And I was like, I don't need to read anymore. I don't want to read anymore. This is where this series is not as fun for me. But the thing is, it also includes all of Frank Herbert's son's terrible books as the backstory, but you can ignore some of that. I have weird feelings about that whole series of things. But I enjoyed it. Like, I'm going to come out, let me not bury the lead. I did dig this game. I think that the book that they put out really captures the feel and the visual look. The beautiful color choices, page layouts are nice. Everything's presented very well. I think it's one of Modiphius's nicest products. I almost wish I had bought the D20s they sold with the different house colors. I didn't go that far, but I did pre-order the book and got that. The book provides a good chunk of the universe backstory and the details and the history without it feeling like you have to know everything or you have to slog through all of it. And it doesn't get into the full minutiae. It tries to give you enough information for the GM to have a good sense of the universe and the place of everyone in it. So solid distillation of a lot of material, which is a challenge. Mechanically, this version of 2D20 is really solid. I've talked before on the podcast about having rewritten Star Trek Adventures to an express version. And the most recent games, this and Dishonored, do a lot of the things that I did with my express version. They cut out a lot of the extra stuff. Got 2 things you've got to pick to decide your roll, and it rolls into this. We don't have extra funky damage dice. We've just got a real basic system. The extra cost charts for spending resources have been cut down. It's a good, simple version of the system. And for the most part, I think it's solid. I also say the character creation system, what you actually get at the start in terms of points to buy your skills and talents and things like that, feels much more generous than any of the other 2D20 games that I've read or played. You feel like you start out as solid, competent characters. And that's great. I think that's really important. And it's much stronger feeling than it was than even in Star Trek. I think here it really feels good. And it's great because your characters are supposed to be not like the Chancellor or the Spy Master or anything like that, but you're supposed to be like the next in line to that within a house. You're up there. You're going to be moving up. You're talking to the big people in the house. And that relates to what I think is the best thing in this game. And that is that the premise of the game is, as a group, you come up with a house within the Dune universe, like House Harkonnen or House Atreides. You come up with that at the start. And you decide, how big is our house? Okay, that sets some things. The bigger your house is, the number of enemies that you have, and whether you have essentially vassal families. At the start, you talk about some aspects and some traits for your house. You come up with the industries that your family is engaged in, like maybe you're the master of agricultural science, or in the case of my players, they chose to be masters of theological engineering. And then you choose 2 others, and that really shapes how the house is. And there are rivals who have maybe also are interested in that. You build your rivals, you kind of roll to see how strong they are and why they hate you and what level of hate they have for you. So that generates stuff right out of the gate. It's a great set of choices. It's not too involved. One of the things it does ask you to do is it has a list of all the positions within the house, and the players have to come up with all the names. And so we had a great time between session 1 and session 2. I just put like a little NPC tab up with the positions, and people got to come up with 2 of them and find pictures. And that really generated some wonderful stuff for session 1 of interacting with these characters. And I love that kind of stuff. That's what I love. I love building up a cast of characters. I love having this house. It's really a dynamite concept. It's a great way to focus. That being said, I think the game could do a lot more to support that. There's not a lot of instruction within the GM section about how you play stuff out at the house level, how you do house moves, things like that. There's stuff in the conflict section about espionage and doing warfare, but it would have been great if there were some more discussions of how to do a house campaign. And I'm going to come back to why that may be a problem here in just a second, but that's a minor point. But now I have to get to the sandworm in the room. Here are some things I'm less sure about. Boy, Frank Herbert's work comes out in the 60s and 70s, and he's one of the first people to talk about ecological collapse and those kinds of issues. But boy, there's a lot of really fucked up regressive shit in the Dune novels. There's torture as a constant thing. There's fat shaming. There's a character who is coded as gay, the Baron Harkonnen, and because he's gay, he's evil. There's very distinct male and female roles biologically. There's eugenics, but without like really addressing what that is. And at some points it's problematic, but at some points it's maybe not. There's a lot of stuff in there that as a GM, you're really going to have to wrestle with. And we went through as players, and we talked about that in our safety tools discussion. We've got the Bene Gesserit order, which is powerful and stuff. And we talked about that men could be part of that order in our vision of it. And in fact, if you look at the Herbert books, they mention men being part of the sisterhood, not in the higher positions and things like that. But we wanted to get away from this idea of biological gender roles determining abilities. So we went that. And in fact, one of the great negative comments I got on the video for our series is somebody railing against me for having eliminated torture for the game, and that this was just fan fiction. And I'm like, yeah, it's a licensed game. Of course it's fan fiction. We're going to play whatever we want. So that's the thing that you have to keep in mind. You've got to deal with that. There's a little bit of talk about safety in the game a little bit later than I would like, and I wish it had a little more discussion of some of these topics, but there you go. The other thing is that it wants you to create this house, this minor house, that you build it up, but then like the example adventure in the back is set on Dune. And it has this split identity that it wants to show you Dune. It wants to have that sand cake and eat it too while you're playing this other house. It doesn't. It's got to make a decision about that. Because you're not playing House Atreides. Are you going to play a house that takes the place of House Atreides? I mean, that's kind of what it maybe wants you to do, but that's not fun. And that's not what I want to do. In fact, we did a very different setup for our game. So that's a thing. It's simplified things in a way I like, but it's still got some mechanical hangups that I cannot stand in games. I'm going to say this. I hate games now that say you can move or you can do something else on your turn. I cannot stand that. Just let me move and do something. The fact that somebody has to go, okay, it's my turn. I've been waiting around for us to come to it, and now I move. That's so maddening. They've got a system for popcorn initiative, the kind of choice pass thing that they've managed to complicate. The whole thing about movement and zones and stuff felt like wonky. And the game also wants to appeal to a certain kind of trad player. And so I think in places it spends a lot of time over explaining stuff to make it look more complicated than it actually is. So when you look through it, you're like, oh, there's a lot of text and a lot of options and things like that. No, it distills down to some very basic things. But the game does a good job of hiding how simple it is. And I think that may be a deliberate thing. There are a few other minor mechanical things, but overall it's good, but you've got to realize that you're going to have to, as a GM, really work through and maybe even mark up the PDF to kind of pull out what the key essential elements of the game are. Those are minor things, because I've really loved it. Like, I've enjoyed building up the feel and the sense and the verisimilitude of the setting without dealing with all the specific details. The players have been fun. We've had a wonderful sort of science fantasy feel to things. I would gladly run this again. I would tweak a few things. It's got an interesting set of mysticism and sci-fi together that isn't science fantasy, but kind of close. And I'd say the core book, even if you're not going to run the system, I'd say it's a great source book if you're like, oh, I want to play something set in Dune. I think that's a great thing. Questions, comments?
Is there something for, like, turning the environment of the planet to your family's advantage? That sort of thing? I mean, that was kind of one of the mystiques of Dune, is the whole planet itself rising up to become an ally to the Atreides family.
I think you could do that given the tools that are presented, but it doesn't explicitly do that. And that's a great point. Like, it would be nice if there were more discussion about how at the family level you could make those maneuvers and things.
I just remember reading it when I was a kid and having that really super strong sense of that environment, because of course that was the thing then.
You talked about how the game wants to have its sandcake and eat it too, and I think, no offense, I think if I calibrate that a little bit more specifically, I think what's going on here is a bunch of publishers and writers and editors and designers like trying to serve as many masters as possible. Mm-hmm. And so when you describe that whole situation of trying to appeal to a trad player, despite the fact that the game's mechanics are actually simple, the writers and editors don't have to do that, but clearly they felt they had to.
I wonder how much of it is a question of interacting with the licensor.
Oh.
I had a friend who worked with Eden Studios during the whole heyday of they're doing Buffy and Angel and Army of Darkness, and the studios pushed a lot on certain things. So I have to wonder if maybe there's a certain amount of the licensee saying, well, you also have to have a bunch of Dune things in here, or it can't all be Dune. I don't know. It's a weird set of decisions, but at the same time, when I think about it, if you didn't have a bunch of Dune stuff in there, I probably would be saying the same thing. I may be being ungrateful here.
Yeah, no, because like when you talked about the whole, it's a game that lets you build a house and lets you like exist within the intergalactic milieu of this world. But it's also like the predefined adventure is trying to slot you into the Atreides role. Mm-hmm. Like that, I think, is another case of like two masters where it's like, are there people who are fans of the story or fans of the world?
Yeah.
And like, the fans of the story will be served by the adventure, but the fans of the world will be like, what? You're grounding us in Arrakis to hang out with these other characters we already knew? Yeah. What a bummer. Like, all that stuff. Like, no, I want to go out into the wider world of the Dune universe. And I feel like I've encountered this before, this idea where I think that the designers and editors don't necessarily not know who their audience is. They just decided they want all the audience.
Yeah. That's a choice. Yeah.
And you talked about licensing and deal arrangements and restrictions, like those interactions like do play a role in how the text gets outputted. And it's also long been my suspicion that some licensors, like I can only speak from my experience in knowing people within the video game industry, or at least video game licensing and all that stuff. Sometimes they'll come to a licensor and the licensor will be all like, well, we can do this, we can do that, and we can do this. And the deal falls apart, or the arrangement falls apart, because they're like, no, we just want you to take our license, our very lucrative license, slap it onto an existing system or a generic system, mm-hmm. so we can score royalty points off the books.
Yeah.
I don't want to name names. I feel that sometimes.
We've certainly seen that with a few recent things. So
yeah.
I think final word would be that one of the things that'll tell us kind of how they're thinking about it is whatever the first source book is.
Oh, yeah.
That'll tell us something about how they envision the direction of this line going. So I'm gonna wait and see on that.
Yeah.
Because unlike, say, the Star Trek license or Conan or anything like that, they haven't come out of the gate with like what the next book is. It's like the same thing with Dishonored. Dishonored was like a one and done. They haven't done anything else for that. I think this is lucrative enough. They'll do something else, and I'll be curious what that is.
Where I split the line on that is I think that a license like Star Trek and Star Wars has a lot of clarity from like decades of like negotiation and discourse, whereas something like Dune is like exceedingly complex, and something like Dishonored is much more nebulous.
Yeah, I think you're right. Listeners, we are going to move on to our second segment.
Can you hear the footsteps in the shadows? Can you smell the metal tang of blood on the air? Can you feel the veil between worlds slipping away with each heartbeat? The Between is here. The Between is a tabletop role-playing game about a group of mysterious monster hunters in Victorian-era London. These hunters learn about monsters and killers throughout the city and conduct investigations in order to neutralize them. Over time, they become aware of the plans of a criminal mastermind who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. They will eventually be forced to confront this mastermind in order to save Queen and Country. The Between is directly inspired by the TV show Penny Dreadful, but also takes inspiration from British horror classics, the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, pulp-era media, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and from Hell. It's powered by the Apocalypse and uses the mystery system from our hit game Brindlewood Bay. The Between comes with a 129-page rulebook, 7 playbooks, 10 scenarios or threats, a mastermind campaign sheet, reference sheets, and a supplement called London at Night, The Unseen. The Between PDF is available now on the Gauntlet Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/gauntlet. The Between will be available on DriveThru RPG starting June 14th.
Listeners, in our second segment, our guest is going to bring up a topic or talk about something that they're working on, the designs, what they're excited about. Matthew, we talked a little bit about this. You're going to tell us about the project you're working on right now and what the background is to that?
Sure. In addition to being a video game reviewer of many years, I am now the managing editor of Xbox Outsider. This is a website I've been working on for the past month or two. We're still very much early going, but I think we've hit some pretty good milestones. The goal is to serve as a guide to the Xbox brand, which sounds extremely shill, but at the same time, when I talked to my collaborator about where we could go in terms of games to media collaborations, we thought like the most exciting thing right now, the most interesting thing right now is Xbox. Like Nintendo is so incredibly reliable as a company, and PlayStation is the market dominator right now.
Yeah.
As far as the console space is concerned, and PC's gonna PC. That market is well served and well established. And
the PC master race will move on.
Well, yeah, and I speak as someone who actually is of the computer gaming world generation of gamers. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't grow up with Nintendo. I was more of a... When people tried to frame computer gaming as a grognard pastime, that's my generation.
Okay.
And Xbox is like the most interesting one because they were in the market minority position for a very long time. Still are, actually. And because of that, it's kind of pushed them to take a lot of risks and take a lot of foresight and planning. And it's really turned the brand around. Yeah, I thought that was just the most interesting way to go about with a website. What we hope in the long term is to serve as a guide, meaning there are a lot of people who know their PlayStations and Nintendos and whatever, and like, it's taken for granted, like how to interact with the digital store, how to access certain games or what kind of subscription services, how to use coins on the Nintendo Direct store. I actually don't know how to do that, but I think if you do, Lowell, because you have Switch.
Yes.
All of that stuff is well known.
But it did take me looking up on Google. I will admit that. So.
Yeah. And I see people who are new to the Xbox platform asking those kinds of questions. What is a Game Pass? Where do I get the cloud gaming? What is the insider programming? All of that stuff. So that is where we hope to arrive in the immediate future. Right now, our focus is on developing original content, opinions, guides, listicles, all of that stuff, because there's no way we're going to crack news. You know what I mean? Like, The funny thing about the games media business is that you could try to deliver news, but so many of the big sites dominate the traffic by default that that's not how it works. Like, I mean, it's good to have it there just to establish some credibility for your site, but it's not going to be the one that is going to crack the metrics for you. And I've seen it reflected in the numbers. So I'm trying to deliver more opinions, more hot takes, all of that good, juicy stuff. We're rapidly spinning up our reviews division. That's going to be a thing coming soon. All told, I think we're really doing well because I used to work for other video game websites as well. The one I last worked at has been around for a decade, and we beat their numbers. I don't even know how I did that. I don't even know how I did that, but I looked it up on Alexa, and I was like, what?
I know we had an interesting set of things when they had the E3 that you were doing a great job of kind of looking at what the announcements were and talking about what the implications were of those announcements in a way I hadn't seen elsewhere. What have you been doing recently that you're pleased with?
I'm pleased with trying to be more forward in my opinions. When you read those opinions, they were much more from a sober and sedate take, and I still take a lot of pride in that, trying to be authoritative and professional in my opinions. But I'm also trying to be more forward with saying, "Oh no, man, that's a bad take. That's stupid." So I've been making sure that our coverage is always critical. So there was some edgelord who was like, "Oh, they should buy Hideo Kojima's stuff." And there was a recent news that Assassin's Creed was going to go games as a service, which is basically, for the listeners, games as a service is that stuff that you probably don't like, which is when a game is online, ongoing, and tries to get you engaged constantly, and it never ends. There's no finite end to it, and hopes that you will spend more money in it, which can be fun, but I understand that a lot of people in the RPG gaming scene do not appreciate the way that it feels exploitative.
It does.
So I've tried to call that out in a recent piece where I said, like, okay, Ubisoft can try to make one of these things for their Assassin's Creed franchise, but they have to first be good at it. So these are takes that I don't think are controversial. I'm not sure if I'd be too proud of, but they won't make me, I don't think the publishers will like seeing that in the headlines necessarily. Fortunately, most publishers and their PR firms are fairly professional about how they handle this. And, I want to put a pin also is that with regards to starting a website like this, website making is hard.
Yeah.
And I think the only reason why I didn't start a website sooner is because I was just too daunted by it. But I have a very supportive partner in the establishment of the website who handles all the technical back end for me. And not just that, but he's like, whatever I can do to help him to help him be proud of what he's working on is what I do. So he makes sure that I can fix the content so that it registers well with the overall internet. And I make sure I don't make content that embarrasses him. I don't think of him as my boss, even though he's giving me a lot of instruction. We're partners on just opposite sides of the content and web optimization.
Oh, that's great. We use a particular tool, and because it is kind of a faceless thing, I have to teach myself the stuff, try to get things. So yeah, it's great that you have an active partner in this.
Yeah, I'm really impressed actually with all the work all of you all do in the Gauntlet, just keeping it together, to be honest.
The center cannot hold.
It's
but
not just a
Rob Rosado can. So
yeah.
Oh yeah.
We lost without him.
Hats off to Rob too.
So what do you think you want to most be doing with this site in the next year? What is it? What's your roadmap, to quote live service things?
The funny thing you say roadmap about live service things is that these roadmaps are usually BS. And I don't mean to be too unkind about it, but it's wishful thinking. It's like saying, we're going to be here and we're going to have content out at this point, but, schedules can change. That's very much evident in the recent release of Cyberpunk 2077, where the game was very controversial in terms of the technical performance of that game, and they promised that they would be delivering content, and they were like... And if you look at the roadmap, it says, content on the other half of the year with no specifics about when it will be, what that will be. And I'm like, you just drew a bar and shaded it. But to answer your actual question, where I want to be is I want to decide to be a place where if you want to figure something out and you're not necessarily American, you can figure it out through the website. We haven't even taken step one towards that, but I think there's something to be said about being from being a Southeast Asian market like the Philippines, or I believe Portugal isn't served, and neither is Brazil. And so a lot of us have to resort to trickery to finagle some of those services. So register American addresses, mark our IP as Argentina, all that kind of stuff. So, number one, be a guide to people who desperately want to be in the Xbox ecosystem for very good reasons relating to value services and all that stuff. And how to, quote-unquote, break in, so to speak. And if the vice president of Xbox, has his way and is able to expand the market so that he can start doing releases in these underserved regions, which is something that he's talked about before, then be a guide for that as well. Be a guide for like, all right, you see all these reports. Because this is the thing that's weird about entertainment journalism, is I always find it weird when I read those blog posts and it's like, here's what's new to Netflix, or here's what's new to coming to Crunchyroll.
Mm-hmm.
And I open it on my app and I'm like, nah, bitch, that's not there. That's the US report, so we want maybe a network of people saying like, all right, here's our Argentina correspondent saying this is how the store works. Here's our Brazil correspondent saying like, this is where you can buy gift cards. I want that sort of like being able to serve audiences and fans of video games in a way that acknowledges the places that they're from, because gamers are all over the world. And I'm just starting with Xbox. I'm not saying I will do other things, but it helps me narrow the scope a little bit more.
That's smart.
Very smart.
I'm very optimistic too, because my partner runs another website for a long time called Serious Gaming, and he and I are blunt about it. The language in Serious Gaming ain't the hottest where I stand in terms of preferences, but it is very successful in the numbers game. I think working together we can do something. We have no delusions we'll ever beat Polygon or Kotaku or Giant Bomb or any of those sites like at their own game, but being able to rank at least in the mid-tier is pretty good success for a bunch of boys from Manila.
It's good stuff, though.
Let's move on to our final segment. So, listeners, in our final segment, each of us will briefly discuss something that is lately inspiring us, providing us joy. So, Sherry, what is giving you life?
So I said I like games, and then I'm going to cut my credibility with all those other people who love games. But I really love games. I like all kinds of games. That's the problem. The one that is killing me right now, that is a brand new game, that's actually a follow-up to a game I'm still playing. So it's Shiny Nikki, and it's a 3D version of a fashion battle game where you have to collect clothes and then essentially put together better outfits than the other players. And you win prizes, fabulous prizes, and more clothes. And that's the whole thing. But the story, that's the mechanics of it. The thing is that the game has this loopy story. Poor Nikki has been thrown into this world that she doesn't understand, but she loves this world because it's so fantastic. It has these 7 nations, and they have very different fashion styles. And instead of fighting, they use fashion to solve all of their disagreements and things like that. But then there's some evil people, and they're trying to bring fighting back, and they're going to destroy us, Mirrorland. Well, since I've been playing the American version, which is like a year behind the Chinese version that is on the servers, it turns out that probably Mirrorland did get destroyed. But in the new game, Nikki goes back into time magically in order to have another chance at preventing the destruction of Mirrorland. And it's this fabulous, it's a great soap opera, but this time now you're meeting all these designers that were there from the beginning of time, and their designs are true, and the power is more explicitly magical. And to this point, it is almost as if fashion styling is like a form of Wulin fighting. It's a martial art almost, because they don't have any fighting. It's all fashion. It's awesome. And he can do all these things. They literally could Lightfoot. That was the last story I read, was one of the guys. He literally Lightfoot out of danger using fashion styling. And it is the best. It's a cute little game. It has a million mechanisms to it. I actually had to flowchart all the different parts of the game that you have to play on a daily basis in order to keep on, moving along in your story. But it's super fun, and it cracks me up. I giggle the whole way through it. It takes itself just the right amount of seriously, and also just enjoys itself, I think.
That sounds
awesome.
Super cool, actually.
It really is.
That sounds really rad. AAA games need to start jumping in on that post-apocalyptic fashion market. It's pre-post-apocalyptic, though. That's the thing, is she's gone back in time to prevent it, so it's just the best. Is that nigh-apocalyptic?
Yeah, I don't know. It's pre-post. It's very complicated.
Matthew, what is giving you life?
What's given me life these past few months is Discord communities and Twitch. Now, That's a very general description, but basically I have been hanging out in lieu of being able to talk to other human beings in the outside world. I've been really, really enjoying connecting with other gamers through Discord and Twitch. When I got off social media and decelerated my Facebook presence, things got a little lonely there, but also it's because I got tired of seeing the same old takes over and over and over again. And so I've been trying to look for communities who not just better reflect my interests, but better reflect a more diverse worldview. Mm-hmm. So that's what's bringing life, which is I'm currently in a server run by a trans man in Berlin who is also a Twitch streamer, and I love it because everybody there is just so like crazy and young and diverse, and it's the most important thing is that it keeps me honest. People like us who are north of our 30s, who are gamers, I think we tend to have very calcified worldviews, or at least worldviews that are beginning to calcify, right? Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. I think I don't agree with a lot of what's going on in that server necessarily, but I'm also like, I need to sit here and listen to people so I can get a zeitgeist.
Yeah.
And also, it's tremendously wonderful. You know, it's not just self-serving, the whole, like, I will get a mental picture of the world kind of thing, but rather, I get to learn a lot about all these things about Japanese video games, which is not in my wheelhouse, about how these kids, like, really understand them, what kind of secrets they know about the companies, and by secrets, I don't mean like whispers. I just mean like they're fans of games just as much as we were fans of games when we were younger. Whereas you and I could probably talk about all these old 80s or 90s companies and like the lore that explains how those games are. These kids are like engaging in the same way with different stuff. And that, I think, is really, really important to me. It's always been important to me to not just stay in touch with games, but to keep up to date with how people regard games. You know, like when people say Fortnite is trash, I'm like, yeah, maybe I don't like that stuff, but it's really important for me to understand what's going on in that space. It's really important for me to understand what's going on with Minecraft and Roblox and mobile games and everything like that, for me to be better at my job and to better understand not just video games, but the future of like digital entertainment. So Discord and a bunch of people who are much younger than me, have very different opinions than me. They give me life because they help me stay grounded.
So for me, I'm going to talk about a book that I listened to as an audiobook called A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Murder in Ancient Rome. It's by Emma Southen. It's a history of Rome. It's a history of murder, judicial, extrajudicial, all that. The voice of the narrator is great, and the voice of the writing is great. It is talking about how creepy Cicero is and how these Romans are really actually pretty fucked up. And it's got a great voice to it. I'm always interested in Roman history, and this one has a very different take on it. It's a delight to listen to, and I think a delight to read. So that is the book that is right now giving me life. Listeners, that's our show. The Gauntlet Podcast is a production of The Gauntlet. We have an online gaming calendar, the Gauntlet Gaming Calendar, where folks can sign up for our sessions. If you've enjoyed the show, consider supporting our Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. That supports everything we do, including our network of podcasts, this one included, and our magazine codex. If you're curious about any of this stuff, like the calendar, the things that we've talked about, you can find out more about all of that at gauntlet-rpg.com. If you need to, you can also reach us on Twitter at GauntletRPG or on Facebook at the Gauntlet-RPG group. Please consider rating and reviewing our show. The algorithm pushes all these things down, so it's always good to have just a little boost. It really does help us out. Sherry, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Matthew, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It was a delight.
Can you give us the link for Xbox Outsider?
Yeah, that's right. We are at www.xboxoutsider.com. That's Xbox Outsider. If you want my video game takes and other sorts of like commentary, you can find me on Twitter at ArceliaMatthew.
Thank you so much. And listeners, that is our show.